There are moments in history that don't announce themselves with fireworks or headlines. They happen quietly, in rooms full of suits and silence, where handshakes matter more than press releases. And in one of those rooms, in April 2025, something shifted. In the icy corridors of Moscow, as most of the world looked elsewhere, three African nations, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, arrived not as petitioners, but as partners.
Now on Thursday, Moscow hosted the foreign ministers from Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, collectively known as the Confederation of the Sahel States. After meeting his counterparts, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russia will help build, train and equip the joint armed forces of the alliance. Russia's top diplomat also accused Ukraine of destabilizing the region, declaring that Kyiv openly supports terrorist groups in this part of Africa.
Together they represent the alliance of Sahel states, a coalition born from upheaval, hardened by sanctions and sharpened by betrayal. But now, they were no longer standing alone. This wasn't a routine visit. It wasn't a friendly exchange of diplomatic pleasantries. This was a tectonic move. These nations, branded as juntas by Western media, didn't fly to Russia to apologize for their revolutions. They came to ratify them. What began as isolated coups has now congealed into something far more dangerous to the established order, a coherent bloc. And in Moscow, they found exactly what they'd been denied in Brussels and Washington: a seat at the table, a voice without condescension, and power without lectures. For the West, it was easy to ignore the signs, easy to write these governments off as transitional, temporary, or doomed to implode. But beneath the rubble of discarded French bases and ECOWAS sanctions, a new foundation was being laid. And Russia, sanctioned, cornered, and increasingly isolated, saw something that others didn't: opportunity. But how did three nations, dismissed as political outcasts, find themselves locking arms with one of the world's most assertive powers? And what does that tell us about the new alliances being forged beneath the radar? Let's find out. To understand how we arrived at a Moscow summit between African juntas and a sanctioned superpower, you have to rewind, not just to a specific event, but to a slow-burning disillusionment that stretched across decades. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso didn't wake up one day and decide to leave the Western sphere of influence. Their exit wasn't impulsive. It was a buildup, a gradual erosion of faith in a system that promised partnership but delivered dependency. These weren't fragile states looking for handouts. They were states held hostage by outdated arrangements. Under the weight of French military interventions, IMF austerity demands, and diplomatic puppeteering by ECOWAS, the cracks deepened. For Mali, the turning point came in 2020 when frustration with France's Operation Barkhane boiled over. What was sold as a counterinsurgency effort had begun to look more like a colonial reoccupation. French troops controlled airports. Military decisions bypassed local authorities. Civilians, caught between militants and foreign soldiers, found no justice and no voice. And when Malian forces tried to assert independence, to decide who could operate on their territory, the backlash was swift, loud, and patronizing. Burkina Faso followed. Once hailed as a democratic darling in West Africa, it spiraled into insecurity as rural communities were devastated by insurgent attacks. The government appeared powerless, not because it lacked courage, but because it had been told for too long to rely on Western partners whose interests didn't extend beyond urban enclaves and extractive contracts. The people grew angry. The military took over, not out of ambition, but out of desperation. Then came Niger, the so-called last ally of the West in the Sahel. When its president was overthrown in 2023, panic rippled through Paris and Washington. But on the streets of Niamey, people were dancing. Not because coups are glamorous, but because the illusion had finally shattered. The illusion that elections controlled by foreign aid donors and soldiers stationed to protect foreign interests were signs of sovereignty. That day, Niger joined its neighbors not just in rejecting a leader, but in rejecting a lie. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. So, what made these three countries different from the countless others that have had turbulent leadership? They didn't just oust presidents, they ousted an entire geopolitical framework, one that dictated who they could trade with, what kind of weapons they could buy, and who they had to invite to their summits. The moment they began questioning that framework, the pushback was immediate. ECOWAS imposed sanctions, cut trade routes, and even floated the possibility of military intervention. But this time, the threats didn't work, because this time, the three weren't isolated. What emerged instead was something unprecedented in modern African politics, a self-declared, unapologetic alliance. The alliance of Sahel states wasn't formed in a Western conference room. It wasn't ratified with foreign consultants in the background. It was born in defiance, in closed-door meetings between military men who had seen enough of foreign policy dressed up as friendship. Its original purpose was simple: mutual defense. If one country was attacked, even economically, the others would respond in solidarity. But as months passed and the threats mounted, something shifted. AES began to look less like a temporary coalition and more like a new political identity. What made this alliance especially dangerous to the West wasn't its military posture, it was its mindset. Unlike other African blocs riddled with compromises, the AES wasn't trying to please anyone. They didn't issue press releases in English and French for donor approval. They weren't seeking re-entry into elite economic clubs. They were, for the first time, crafting their own terms, from security to currency policy. And in doing so, they exposed the hollowness of decades of Western engagement. Aid, they realized, came with strings. Military support came with surveillance. Democracy came with externally approved candidates. And even when Western governments claimed to support African development, it was always development that suited foreign investors, not local people. The AES ripped off that mask, and the world didn't like what it saw underneath, but walking away came at a cost. Trade froze, development projects were halted, bank accounts tied to international financial systems were locked. It was economic warfare disguised as diplomacy. The West expected them to crawl back, to apologize, to make concessions. They didn't. Instead, they started looking elsewhere. Not to China, not yet, but to something more immediate. Something, or someone, equally scorned by the West, equally isolated, equally angry: Russia. But before they walked into the Kremlin, they had to walk out on something else. Not just ECOWAS or France, but an entire post-colonial illusion. And that act of refusal, that deliberate exit from dependency, is what turned a collection of coups into a political movement. The question now wasn't whether they'd survive outside the Western fold. It was who would walk in to meet them. And when the doors of Moscow opened, the answer became clearer than anyone expected. The day the Sahel turned its back on the West, it didn't fall into chaos. It fell into Russia's hands, quietly, strategically, almost as if Moscow had been waiting for this moment all along. While Western media scrambled to diagnose the region's descent into authoritarianism, Russian diplomats were already sketching a different diagnosis, one built on shared grievance, mutual utility, and the cold logic of global realignment. For Russia, still bleeding from sanctions and locked out of European influence, the arrival of the AES was more than welcome. It was timely. This wasn't charity, it was calculus. Moscow didn't offer them slogans about democratic values or hollow praise for resilience. It offered concrete deals: military training, battlefield logistics, air defense equipment, armored vehicles, and perhaps more importantly, respect. It wasn't the weapons that mattered most, it was the tone. Unlike the West, Russia didn't treat these nations like ticking bombs or toddlers with rifles. It treated them like adults, volatile, yes, but sovereign. This subtle shift in posture, from paternalism to partnership, was all it took to open the gates. Within weeks of initial contact, the coordination began to move at a pace that stunned even the most seasoned analysts. Russian advisors began working closely with defense ministries across the AES countries. Not as detached consultants, but as embedded tacticians. They weren't reading PowerPoints in air-conditioned offices in capital cities. They were walking along mine-ridden roads, sitting in joint command rooms, sleeping in sand-caked bases near active conflict zones. In Niger, Russian specialists helped remap areas prone to militant infiltration using satellite surveillance. In Mali, they began retraining counterinsurgency units, adapting old Soviet doctrines to the unforgiving Sahelian terrain. In Burkina Faso, the focus shifted toward engineering, fortifying garrisons, repairing abandoned airstrips, and setting up supply corridors in areas the French forces once neglected. But Russia's play wasn't just about triage, it was about construction. It became clear early on that Moscow wasn't simply supporting the AES militarily, it was investing in an architecture of long-term influence. The most radical element of that plan? The creation of a joint Sahelian armed force, a supranational command center that would unify the military capabilities of all three countries under a single operational doctrine, with Russian assistance baked into its DNA. This idea wasn't just ambitious, it was transformative. No African regional bloc had ever attempted such a thing. Not ECOWAS, not the AU, not even the G5 Sahel. They had talked about integration. They had even staged joint drills, but they never centralized real command. The AES, with Russian encouragement, moved in the opposite direction. They started consolidating command structures, drafting chain-of-command protocols, and assigning interoperability standards that would allow soldiers from Mali to be seamlessly deployed in Burkina Faso and vice versa. Behind the scenes, Russian officers helped define everything from field communication protocols to supply line management. What emerged wasn't just a patchwork alliance, it was the prototype of a regional army, one that would answer not to Paris, not to Washington, not even to Moscow, but to the alliance itself. Moscow's involvement wasn't about creating dependency. It was about embedding itself so deeply into the muscle and memory of this force that it became irreplaceable. And it wasn't just soldiers. Russia began to open its military academies to AES officers, granting scholarships and fast-tracked entry into elite institutions in places like Kazan and St. Petersburg. For every Western military attaché expelled from Ouagadougou or Bamako, a new generation of Sahelian officers was being flown eastward, trained in Russian battlefield tactics, political discipline, and strategic planning. It was the reverse of the colonial brain drain, a deliberate cultivation of ideological and operational alignment that no Western partner had dared attempt. Critics in the West called it manipulation. But in the streets of Gao, Niamey, and Bobo-Dioulasso, it looked a lot like competence. These were nations under siege, not by Russia, but by lawless insurgencies, economic collapse, and the ghosts of failed promises. When Russia showed up, it didn't ask for apologies. It asked for coordinates. And there was one more advantage that Russia exploited with brutal efficiency: speed. Where Western aid packages took months of approval, layers of bureaucracy, and dozens of compliance checks, Russian deliveries landed in days. Ammunition, communication gear, armored transport. The AES didn't need more reports, they needed results. Russia delivered those results with a swiftness that embarrassed every G7 partner still debating conditions for engagement. But make no mistake, this wasn't Moscow being charitable. This was power being repurposed. In Africa, Russia found something more valuable than markets or minerals. It found a new geography for influence, a blank canvas of abandoned alliances and betrayed trust, where its role as a partner, arms dealer, and mentor could coexist without contradiction. And the AES? They found a co-author for their future, one willing to write it in a language the West had long stopped speaking, mutual interest without moral superiority. By the time the AES foreign ministers arrived in Moscow, the framework was already in motion. The alliance had a direction, a doctrine, and now, a benefactor. The question was no longer if Russia would step in, it was how far it was willing to go. And as the handshakes in Moscow turned into signed agreements, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about military aid. This was about replacing an empire. For months, the partnership between Russia and the Sahel had been quietly forming, in desert outposts, in gold mine negotiations, in military training camps far from the media's reach. But then came the moment when the alliance stepped into full view. April 2025, when the foreign ministers of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso boarded their planes and landed in Moscow. What had been happening behind the curtain was now center stage. For the first time, the world was forced to look directly at the alliance it had so carelessly dismissed. This wasn't just another diplomatic trip. This was the first official summit between the Alliance of Sahel States AES and the Russian Federation. The first time the AES stood united before a global power as a formal bloc. And not just any bloc, but one forged through rejection, revolution, and resistance. The symbolism was sharp. 3 former colonies, bound together by shared betrayal, now seated across the table from a country that had its reasons to hate the Western order. It wasn't just business, it was a declaration. The optics said it all. Flags of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso flew alongside Russia's double-headed eagle. Red carpets were rolled out, but this time without lectures, without translators from Brussels, and conditionalities buried in small print. Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, stood not as an overseer, but as a host. Calm, calculated, and ready to ink a new chapter. Cameras captured the handshakes. But what mattered most happened off-camera. In the signed memorandums, the private pledges, the strategic timing of every word. The summit had 4 pillars: military, economic, diplomatic, and symbolic convergence. First is military coordination. Lavrov confirmed what analysts had suspected. Russia would increase arms shipments, expand training programs, and support the formation of the joint Sahelian military force, a unified army across all AES states, with Russian technical assistance embedded in its command structure. Unlike NATO, there would be no hierarchy. Unlike France, no illusions of control. This was architecture for mutual defense, not empire. Second, economic infrastructure. Russia proposed joint ventures in mining, energy, and transportation. Not just uranium contracts, which were already being restructured, but energy deals that included micronuclear reactors and Sahel-wide solar grids. New rail lines were mapped. Agreements for resource refining on site were discussed. Western firms had once removed raw materials and sent back debt. Russia, it seemed, was offering to help process those materials within the Sahel, turning raw extraction into national profit. It was a reversal of the neo-colonial trade pattern the West had perfected. Third, diplomatic recalibration. The AES states floated the idea of establishing a joint embassy in Moscow. Not 3 separate missions, but a single united presence representing the bloc's new geopolitical identity. Russia agreed to explore a mirror policy, a dedicated AES liaison bureau in Moscow, possibly led by a new envoy to West Africa. Even more notably, talks began on coordination in international forums, from the United Nations to regional African organizations, forming a voting bloc that could back Russian resolutions and amplify AES interests on global platforms. But it was the symbolic victory that made headlines. In every public speech, the AES leaders didn't just praise Russia, they exposed the West. Mali's Abdoulaye Diop called Russia a partner of dignity. Niger's Bakary Yahou Sangaré said the summit marked the end of political hypocrisy. Burkina Faso's delegation went further, calling France's involvement in the Sahel a decades-long illusion of protection. These weren't diplomatic niceties, they were public severances of a political past. And Russia knew the weight of these words. It didn't need to gloat. It let the world draw its conclusions. While the West wagged its finger, Russia opened its hand. The reaction outside Moscow was swift and furious. France's foreign ministry called the summit deeply concerning. EU officials accused Russia of manipulating unstable regions. The US State Department issued a veiled threat, warning that any deepening ties could lead to further isolation from the international financial system. But those warnings felt oddly dated, like a teacher threatening detention to students who had already left school. Because by now, the AES wasn't asking for re-entry into Western favor. They weren't trying to rebuild bridges, they were demolishing the docks. Even more unsettling for Western observers was what didn't happen at the summit. There was no apology for rejecting democracy in its Western form, no regret over expelling French troops, and no effort to placate international donors. Instead, what took shape was something most feared but never believed possible. A self-aware Pan-African military bloc, backed by a nuclear power, willing to defy global norms and build its own. And the world took notice, not because of what was said, but because of where it was said. Moscow, the very capital the West had tried to isolate, now hosting African leaders as equals, now forging a new alliance that just 2 years ago would have been unthinkable. In that single summit, a pivot became a path. What began as quiet cooperation in rural deserts had now become an international alliance, visible, vocal, and, perhaps most importantly, irreversible. The only question left was how far this new bloc would go. Because the Moscow summit didn't just finalize deals. It planted a flag in the middle of the 21st century's new global map. Do you think this news will scare the West? Will they try to manipulate this as well? Let us know in the comments section. Does this officially mean the end of West's influence in Africa? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.